Hello, everybody. This is NGO Soul and Strategy, and I'm Tosca. We all know that there is a role for management consulting companies, companies that focus on different types of organizational development services in both in the international development industry and more broadly in the private sector, obviously in various countries and with NGOs. These days, there is a wide range of choices when it comes to African-led and owned management consulting companies. And RavelWorks Africa is one of them. The company specializes in HR, so human resources, people development, and learning, and it serves clients across sectors. We'll hear more about that in a moment with a social mission. I listened to Faye Ekong at a recent Umentum webinar on non-Western leadership models and leadership development. It was called Flipping the Script. And I really liked Faye's no nonsense, say it like it is style of talking. So I knew she would have a lot to say, and therefore that I needed to invite Faye on the podcast. So Faye, welcome to NGO Soul and Strategy.
Thank you so much, Tosca, for having me on your podcast. I'm excited to be here and to have this discussion with you.
I know, me too, because I know I'm going to learn things and we're going to have some fun too, I suspect. So listeners, let me tell you a little bit about Faye. So Faye is the managing director at RavelWorks Africa, and she'll talk in a moment about what that company stands for the last 6 years or so. She has held several leadership roles at the NGO Action Against Hunger. She's worked at the well-known MDF Management Consulting company. She has over 15 years experience in human resource management, organizational design, learning and development, coaching, and employee engagement programs, including at the executive level. She and her company work across government agencies, private sector companies, nonprofit entities in not just Africa, but also Europe, Asia, and North America. And she is certified by the Society for Human Resource Management as a senior certified professional. So with that, Faye, as I said, let's talk a little bit about the identity of RavelWorks Africa. How did you end up co-founding a management consulting company, and why is it called RavelWorks?
It's a very good question, and I'll start with our name because RavelWorks, oftentimes people have an idea that RavelWorks sounds like we're in the construction industry, and they wonder what is a construction company doing in OD and people in culture and learning and development. So I like to say that we are in the business of building, but not in the business of building buildings, but rather building organizations. So having said that, I would love to share this kind of, inspirational story of how we came with the name. But in reality, it's not true. I mean, we had to pick 5 names to register our company, and the other ones were gone. And I'm very lucky that my co-founder, the creative director of RavelWorks Africa, is extremely creative. And he just came together with RavelWorks, and that was the one that they accepted. So we said, let's go for it.
Love the story.
But to your second question, or your first question rather, why did we found it? What inspired us? I think it was a mix. So both myself and my co-director have quite varied background in private sector, in science, in the nonprofit and humanitarian. And we saw that across the board, certain problems tended to be quite common. Many agencies, many companies have similar issues. And we also started to get concerned that a lot of the solutions to those problems were being imported. So whenever there was a training or consultancy, there was always, I say in quotes, a Western company that was coming to bring these solutions, come in with their KPIs, wonderful Gantt charts, and then leave after 6 weeks or 3 months. And the organization stays more or less in the same space. So we started to ask ourselves, well, actually, are there no local solutions that can be scaled? Is it really that we have nothing here? But also we asked ourselves, what does the future of work really look like, and what is needed to be fit for purpose and fit for the future from a competency, system, structural perspective. So that's how we started. But honestly, Tosca, we started on a whim. We said, let's try it and we see where it goes. Obviously, it's gone quite well. So we had some idea. Yeah.
Yeah, and it has gone quite well, right? You have grown. There's a lot of appetite for your services. And tell us more about those services, and then tell us a little bit about your typical clients, because there's a range there, I sense.
Yeah. So our typical services, like I said, are informed by what does the future of work look like. That's our main kind of questions. And then we answer them by looking at the future of work vis-a-vis OD, organizational design or development solutions. That could be, for example, restructuring. That could be organizational assessments, could be about organizational culture. We look at it from an HR perspective, systems and processes perspective, and also from a tech perspective. So that's really where my co-director comes in a lot, looking at the technologies that are needed in order for our workforces to, manage what's going on. So that can be e-learning courses. We do a lot of those for some of our clients, communication and visibility campaigns, etc. So that's kind of the broad range. And then you were saying about our clients. Again, very unusual. It's interesting to see how you start your business with an idea and then you land somewhere completely different. The market determines what they want. So initially we had this idea to say we will serve the African market predominantly, to have an African company providing organizational solutions for African companies. However, it's turned out over the years, the majority of our clients are, to a large extent, North American and European clients. So seems like there was some value for them in the kind of services or approach or thinking that we were providing. And like you said, quite a wide range from a lot of humanitarian and INGOs, NGO actors, to then also a private sector or government's subcontracting kind of agreements. So the range is very wide, but it also suggests to you, Tosca, that in general, organizational problems are quite similar, no matter the sector or the location.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I think sometimes, especially in the NGO sector, we're overplaying that we're so unique compared to other organizations. So just to get a rough sense, what is the rough percentages for private sector, government, and non-government?
Oh, that's a good question. I actually don't have this kind of data off the top of my head. Let me put it this way. I know when we started, I would say between 60 and 75% was really INGO humanitarian, nonprofit. That mix, I mean, we opened in 2018, so we've had quite a bit of time since then. That mix has shifted. I would guesstimate or estimate that today probably about half our portfolio is still non-profit or foundations, INGOs, this kind of stuff. But also in that mix is also social enterprises.
Interesting.
So
Yeah, nice. Okay, good. And you're suggesting that there has been quite a bit of appetite, quite a bit of demand, and we'll return to that question later on. So during our prep meeting, you talked, and you mentioned it again just now, that the continent needs African solutions to African problems. That makes a lot of sense, right? And I wondered, for the field of management and leadership, right, which is the world that you and I live in, as well as for organizational development and design more broadly, what does that mean? What does that look like? How, for instance, will management consulting, so the art and science and practice of consulting in the management field, how does that look different if this principle would be applied more often?
Yeah. So one is that in general, if we look at the management and leadership literature, for the longest time, it has been dominated by the West. Most of our theories, approaches, etc., come from the West, whether that is from the US or European kind of influence. And we have tried to, for the longest time, how do I say, copy and paste it into other contexts, and it didn't work. So even if we just look from the Western perspective, the way management is done in a US context is very, very different from the Scandinavian management model, right? Which has emerged over the recent few decades, where they say, actually, we're much more flat, we're much more participatory, etc. That works in our context, whereas in the US or maybe even a UK environment, it's much more about, profits, shareholder values, senior leadership making decisions, everybody just fall in line with it. Now, when we take that a couple of steps further into the so-called, in quotes, global South, when we start looking into, I know Japan is technically not classified at this, but Japan, India, etc., all started to develop their own management and leadership approaches, which were grounded in the contextual nuances of that region or that particular country, which includes your values, experiences, cultures, etc. And so then you start to see, actually, that is why we have a lot of Japanese and also Indian companies making quite big global headwaves, because they said, okay, I like this and this from Norway, I like this from the US, but this is how I need to holistically apply it within in my context. And the same is from an African perspective. What we have lacked over the last couple of decades is there has not been really an African management or leadership approach that has made it into the mainstream to say this works for us, or this is how we can adapt it for our particular setting. And so that's why I don't think we can be surprised when certain approaches and solutions fail, because they're not grounded in those values. Yeah.
Do you, one comment and then a follow-up question.
Sure.
The way you characterize the, let me call it Anglo-Saxon, right, management and leadership literature. And when you and I talk about literature, I think we're both meaning not just the academic literature, obviously, but particularly the practitioner literature, right? When you characterize the Anglo-Saxon ones in the beginning of your answer as a more, well, you said more shareholder and profit for the private sector, etc., focused, but also less participatory. Would you agree that actually, I see a little bit of a convergence in some ways? There is now, in the last decade or so, more of a focus on employee engagement, participation, flatter structures, motivation, and all these things, right? So there's a little bit of a converging happen in terms of between big strands of thinking. Would you agree or not?
Yeah, absolutely. I do agree that we see there's been way more focus, especially in the last, I'm going to say 10 to 15 years, like you're saying, on a more transformative leadership. And what does that mean to be more inclusive, DEI or DIB, for sure. However, where I will, it's not a challenge so much, Tosca. It's more when you look at some of the African humanism and then some of the African humanistic approach, you will find that was there from the start. So what is now being heralded as new approaches to, the human-centered value proposition, employee engagement experience, as a leader, be humble, etc., transformative leadership, feminist leadership, all these new terms. When you look in many, many African cultures and our history, our cultural north, that's been there from the start. It's just not necessarily recorded in the same ways. It's not peer-reviewed in the same, that's a different story about decolonizing research and knowledge. So yes.
Yeah, and it's ironic in a way, and we have had several other thought leaders on this podcast. For instance, Adama Coulibaly and Charles Kojo van Dijk and Taka Awori, for instance, is coming up shortly. But I actually see, that there is a little bit. A little bit of a coming to what was, as you just told us, in African humanism there from the beginning, right? So there too, I see a little bit like, we're actually starting to all converge, which I think is healthy, because it means then the whole body of thinking is richer, right?
Yes.
But Faye, one follow-up question. When you say some things don't work, give me some examples of actual cases where you see time and time again that Global North management consulting companies or other advisors, like people like myself, individual advisor, blah, blah, where they applied advice in certain areas where it just does not work time and time.
Right. So there's a couple. I mean, the first one that comes to my mind is really the inherent or underlying mental model that you go into it with. Which naturally, that mental model is informed by your culture, your background, etc. Now, across Africa and also the global south, I will dare to say, I might not be accurate everywhere, but we have a much more communal society, a much more a communal way of approaching things. And when I talk about that in terms of compassion, solidarity, respect, dignity, we take a lot more time when it comes to understanding and setting up the scene. Then, you know, even if the KPIs will get delayed a little bit, or even if it doesn't make full sense in the Raki or in the organogram, but it is important because it gives all of us that sense of participating, equality, communalism. And so very often you will find that Western management consultancies, not always, but you come in, the framework is there, we need 2 weeks for this, 3 weeks for this, we come, do that, that. And everybody else is left reeling like this because you've not checked on us, you've not asked us anything, you've not engaged with us in a non-professional way. You've not even had a cup of tea with us to just have a laugh or something like that. So that already puts a kind of barrier. And I understand that. I'm saying that because recently I was at an event with the Swiss Chamber of Commerce here, or the Swiss kind of business community, and they were talking about the difference between, you know, doing business in Switzerland vis-a-vis doing business in Kenya. And so you had on the Kenyan side, lots of people saying it's crazy. You just come in, this is the plan, this is what, nobody has even said good morning, how are you? Like not even 5 minutes to, you know, connect. And the Swiss were saying exactly the opposite. I didn't know. I had to first, you know, ask a question, you know, have a kind of human bond before we can do our work. Yeah.
And that mistake you're saying, and I fully respect that, has been made over and over and over again.
Yes.
Okay.
There's also and I don't know, Tosca, if I interpret it as kind of cosmetic control is what I like to call it, which is a lot of times you will see this kind of approach of deadlines, timelines, Gantt charts, update, let's have a progress update, let's have a meeting, let's have a, and it's kind of almost, it gives, I'm going to speak very broadly, but gives Western consultancy firms or Western managers, leaders, a kind of fake sense of control, or project managers. Oh, I've checked. Yeah, they're still on board for, which is not really so much part of all of the cultures here, because, you know, if you tell us the deadline is Thursday, I know what is Thursday, so do you. You don't need to check with me on Monday and on Tuesday and on Wednesday about the progress for Thursday. Check that on Thursday. So, it's been interesting for us to observe, because even with many clients or many collaborations we've had, the volume of trackers and online tools to, you know, update, you know, delete and put the new name and the new date. And it's like, why are we doing it's extra work, which doesn't add any value other than give a fictitious or cosmetic sense of control to the leader or project manager to be able to open a spreadsheet and say, this is in progress.
I recognize it. Would you say that, again, you and I are both generalizing, that particularly mid to large size management consulting companies have this very kind of scripted way of doing, and that amongst the micro companies, like my own company is one of them, and the small ones and the individual solopreneurs, etc., there is a bit more of a variation in how much that that cosmetic control is top of mind for the practitioner?
Yeah. I mean, naturally, the larger you are, the more systems you need to have in place and the more structure and framework, because you don't know who's going to be in the job or in the position. So for sure. And also for smaller companies like yourself, but even for RavelWorks, we're quite small. For a long time, we have been able to manage quite flexible in the sense of we base it on the needs of the clients, what we hear, but also what we hear underneath the surface. Yes, sometimes I can push and say by Monday, but it means that you might not have reflected properly, you've not involved the right stakeholders. So let's delay it by a week, but then we have overall buy-in, even though the tracker will be red. So that's kind of a,
So on the other hand, so playing a little bit of devil's advocate here, Faye, are there truly big differences in terms of organizational development needs, pain points, as well as possibilities, especially when we talk about organizations in the social sector, between global South, quote unquote, and global North? especially, let me punctuate that question a little bit more, outside the field of people management, what motivates people in the workplace, national, cultural, or regional cultural norms around that, etc. Do you feel that there are big differences outside that field of people management?
I would say yes and no. So in general, from our observations, is that most OD issues are people issues, right? And whether that you're doing it in Sweden, you're doing it in Zimbabwe, you're doing it in Washington, D.C., I mean, it's understanding what is important to the people or the constituency that I serve, which is my internal clients, i.e. my staff, and also my, my communities or customers in that sense. And so once I've understood that, a lot of the resistance, a lot of problems go away. If I understand what are people's fears, etc., that is not unique to, any context. It's just that what is important in a DC context might be very different to what is important in a, let's say, Ugandan or Somali context, right? But the issue is understanding. Where I think there might be a difference, I mean, we know across the board that Africa is the world's youngest continent, right? So now, and we can see that just recently with how Gen Z have mobilized across many different countries and are making more demands. So in that sense, I think there is a difference because what your future or current workforce is looking for, or the bulk of that workforce, is completely different from countries. Italy, Japan is a good example where you have an aging workforce, where people are looking for stability, for pension, long-term security. And now you find with younger populations are looking for purpose, belonging, meaning, engagement in their work, and also looking for, let's say, employers that are perhaps more socially conscious or, investing in green economies or all of these kind of things. So that is a different lens which I see oftentimes organizations, and I'm sorry to say this, but particularly in the nonprofit sector, that strategic foresight to really look at how are my demographics, how is my landscape changing in the next 5-10 years, that capacity is almost non-existent. People just repeat over and over what they've been doing. Granted, it's because of funding cycles, donor requirements, but they're missing out on huge steps that they could be making to be relevant in the next 5 to 10 plus years.
Yeah. One thing that I will say, just a little anecdote, but I recently was doing a work with a fairly large Asia-based foundation, and in interviewing grantee leaders, I was struck how, talking about globalization, how the theme of mental health of the newest generation on the job from a managerial perspective was a big concern. And it was true across like 6 countries in Asia where I was interviewing people. It was exactly the same issue as we see here, for instance, in America, where I live, or as I know about it in Europe, where I'm from. So I thought, wow, talking about globalization of workforce issues, there was no difference. So just kind of striking. Now, I'm wondering if you want to shed some light on a tension that, for instance, let's say that a leader who is themselves from the Global South, they work in a global INGO. Do you see examples or a phenomena where in the daytime, those leaders or managers have to embody an organizational culture that has been propagated, if you will, model, or that has been developed or promoted, that they have to model in the day, and at night in their families, amongst their friends, and in their communities, there is another set of leadership and management behaviors and practices and habits that is expected of them. What's that like to have to alternate between those two? And my second question is that different or not really from here in the US, what people call code switching, right? A term used in cross-racial settings in a country like the US, where people of color feel obliged to, quote unquote, act white in certain work settings and have a different code at home.
I mean, I think you've hit the nail on the head. So again, in many, let's say, in the nonprofit sector and humanitarian in general, in order to get into leadership, senior leadership position, there's certain behavior, certain exposure, experience, education that you need to, be able to showcase in that sense. So you find for a lot of senior leaders, you might in an NGO have diversity, but you do not have inclusion. Just saying I have 4 Black people, 3, Asian and 2 women just means I'm kind of coloring my leadership or management team, but I expect all of you to behave like me. When you come here, I want you to have the same values I have, the same context, the same jokes, the same, I want you to be offended by the same things I'm offended by and not offended by things that I'm not offended by. And we see that really across the board, whether it comes to religion, whether it comes to, cultural and ethnicity, etc. Like, I'll give you a very good example. In most Western countries, ethnicity, tribe does not exist. That concept is not a concept which is important, right? You have different nationalities. Yeah.
Tribe, that term at least, is not necessarily a recognized ethnicity. In certain countries can be an important category that is people sense, right? At least. But please keep going.
No, you're right. Actually, it's good for you to correct me. I mean the issue of tribe more specifically, right? But on our end, and across the global south, sometimes that is crucial. It's really, really important. And your tribe determines how you behave, how the gender roles, what men can say in a meeting, what they can't say, how women should respond to those comments in a business meeting, all of these kind of things. So those are nuances which are very often missed by Western leaders. I've heard over and over again people feeling when they join Western NGOs as senior executives, senior leaders, that I feel like I'm here to color the room because you needed somebody of color in your management team or on your board. I don't feel I can speak out from my cultural and personal experience because it will not be appreciated here. And sometimes also I feel you are forcing things down my throat which go fundamentally against my religion, but in order to keep my job, for example, I have to smile and say yes. Now, that's not a way to manage an organization. The same way you are now saying about what we say code switching. So of course we see this all the time. There's a kind of certain behavior you do when you go to the meeting in, I don't know, Geneva, because that's what's required, and then a completely different conversation that happens afterwards. It's not even just because of global north, global south. If you think about it, even in the West, whereas it's that very often as colored women, we are termed as aggressive very quickly. Because once you speak out, that means you're aggressive, you're not a team player. No, that's just who I am. I'm just expressing myself. That should not be a problem. So you learn in that business or organization environment, here, stay quiet, or, try and pretend to be more demure than you are, because if you say, no, I don't agree, it's like, whoa. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're really talking about the fact that while the identity-wise, while the ethnic and racial composition in, let's say, humanitarian sector may have become more diverse, the extent to which the culture of the organization is still white normed and Western normed is still significant, and there can be a huge gap, and some organizations may not ever want to bridge that gap. Right. And it could be really difficult around some value differences. Right. But that's maybe for another time for you and I to discuss. But I totally recognize. Yes, that I think is completely true. So when it comes to leadership models, Faye, are there truly different paradigms or philosophies or approaches? You've talked about communalism, and that's often when I ask this question, is the first element, attribute that comes up yet. So are we talking about truly different paradigms for leadership models? Or are we talking about different nuances or flavors? I honestly don't know, so I'm asking you.
So it's, it's an interesting question actually to explore. I mean, as you know, I'm a big a fan of Ubuntu management, Ubuntu leadership, because that's of interest to me personally, which is, African philosophy or African humanist philosophy, and then also extends itself to leadership. Of course, when you dig into it, you will find a lot of similarities to what is now coming out of the global West, like I was saying, a global North, excuse me, like I was saying around transformative leadership and all of this more inclusive. So I think that it's more a question of nuances, because that the very, very harsh, like we had in the, what is it called? Fayol type management, or what is it called now? There's those initials, 1920s, 30s, which was really focused on production only.
Right.
That is gone. We're in a knowledge economy. We can't. And in 2018, I believe it was, actually, PwC issued a really interesting forecast for the world of work by 2030, and they did it via colors, right? So they said by 2030 we might have a red, blue, green, and I believe yellow world of work, right? And so when you look at what is entailed in most of those worlds of work, for instance, yellow is very much focused on the human element, right? So organizations and companies that put people first, that engage in people-centric processes, systems, will have a competitive advantage and will be able to sustain themselves, because how you do that, whether you use this approach, this theory is said, doesn't matter. The core issue is putting people first and recognizing the needs of those people. The green prediction was more organizations and companies who are more socially conscious and more environmentally conscious, understanding what is my impact on the wider ecosystem, the wider community will have again, a competitive advantage. And again, doesn't matter which theory you use for that, which leadership philosophy you subscribe to, because the core is that. And I think we see that everywhere. Same with red, which was more about flexible and agile teams, and blue is the only, let's say, extreme, which says that by 2030 there is the potential that corporate giants or big even NGOs will reign supreme, right? Everybody else will be swallowed up. It doesn't matter, you small companies, small NGOs, go away. It's just we need two big ones and they will control the world. In which case, that's
conglomerates, kind of.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, more powerful even than nation states. So
yeah. Interesting. But so tell me, what does an office look like? Well, office is already a outdated term now. Tell me what a team looks like that is governed, quote unquote, by an Ubuntu management style. I want to be able to visualize it.
Yeah. So I would say in cases where I've seen it works well is where people or leaders prioritize people and people's well-being over organizational results, KPIs, outputs, all of these kind of stuff. And once you have, and I don't mean it's a soft style, not at all. But once you have a solid foundation where people in your team trust each other, they respect each other, they lean on each other, people will work for you on Saturday, Sunday at 3 a.m. because they feel a sense of belonging. I'm not just employed, I'm part of this, and I want to make it succeed, because Ubuntu is I am because you are. Right? So we understand the collective impact of that. So I want to be very careful, because I know sometimes I've heard, especially in the West, Ubuntu is becoming very popular. It's called Ubuntu, and it's not understood, because Ubuntu doesn't mean feel good. It doesn't mean let's do team building every month. It doesn't mean let's have lunches together, throw the ball, or this. That's not what it's about. It's really, really the best way you can do it as leaders is you need to peel off some of those layers of your onion and become more vulnerable with your teams, because that's the only way. If I invite you in, and that means me saying, I'm struggling here, I'm also overwhelmed, I'm tired, I don't know what to do, I become more human to you. And then you can tell me, ooh, even me. And so it's not about throwing a ball in a team building. It's about those really honest conversations. It's about people seeing me in with all my facets, right? Not to an extreme, but you see what I mean.
Yeah, I do see what you mean.
And you can feel it very quickly when you walk into a team where maybe they didn't know it was Ubuntu, right? But where there's that really solid connection, you feel it from the first meeting, whether it's on Zoom, you even feel it from how they communicate on email. When you find an organization where everybody needs to be CC'd in, if 5, 7 people, 8, everybody's making comments, it suggests to you that there's an issue of mistrust. Something is not aligned. Because if I can't come back and say, I made this decision, and the rest of my crew says there will be a reason why she made it and we trust her, we have a problem, right?
Yeah, I understand. Okay, let me switch because we have not that much time left. Let me switch to the topic maybe briefly, but it's important, and you and I mentioned it before, decolonizing research on management and leadership, right? There's a lot of talk about the need to decolonize research in general and knowledge, as you say, and what counts as knowledge, right? What constitutes knowledge.
Yeah.
So when we look, and we know that you mentioned peer-reviewed journals on the academic side, but even kind of top journals, what is considered top practitioner journals, magazines, online magazine, blah, 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 right? We see that even though there's a lot of talk about it now more before, and some steps are being taken, it still, non-global north originated work does not nearly get as much attention.
Correct.
How can we overcome that?
Oh, you're asking me a big question, which is a systems question. I don't have the solution to it, but I will agree with you that the non-Western work takes, actually, let me put it this way. Work conducted by Western practitioners in the global South and then brought back to the, all of a sudden it blows up, right? But the information that guided that research is coming from the sources here. And so I think there's across the board a kind of, one is that question, it's again going back to mental models. What do I consider sound and solid research, and why? Why is it only a good input to me if you can, name to me your independent variable, your dependent variable, your 5 guiding theories, and you can show me that you've at least interviewed 2,000 or 3,000 people? Why is that the only way that knowledge can be generated, for example? And I like using the example, you might have heard me on other podcasts, is I got very fascinated by the informal sector across the global South, because that is a sector which informs sometimes 80, sometimes even 90% of our economy, right? All the income and jobs are generated there. And that sector works. People are employed, they send money to each other, exchange goods, services, they get sick, they come back. There's no philosophy, guiding framework. There's no kind of research. It has been very organic. So there's something we can learn from being, I would say, more humble and less fast to judge and say, well, that point is not valid because it's not, there's not a document to back it up.
I was going to say,
there
it's
might
not
be
codified.
Exactly. But you might have 30 years of experience, I don't know, driving a motorbike, picking and dropping people, in Central African Republic. How can I dismiss that lived experience and say, well, mine is better because, I read, a couple of articles and did a statistical model.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say exactly the same thing as Taka Awori, who I recently recorded a conversation with, and which we are also going to drop in a month or two. So that the informal sector is an example of non-codified management knowledge, right? That should be just as much respected as those things that are codified in global north founded journals and magazines and websites, etc. So let's talk finally about management consulting companies, especially in the humanitarian sector, and competitive advantage, etc.
Yeah.
Clearly, you've hinted in your introduction that there has been a healthy demand for your type of RavelWorks Africa services from the beginning, and that was 2018, right? Why do you think that is? And where do you feel, from a competitive advantage perspective, your type of company still faces obstacles?
Yeah. So it's a good question, and I'm not sure I don't have the codified data on this, what it is. I think one of the things that has helped us as RavelWorks. We always call ourselves a niche or boutique consultancy firm, and that's really helped us in the sense of it is not in our interest to grow, to blow up, to have 10,000 staff all over the world. And so that helps us have a much more tailor-made and customized and individualized approach with our clients, where they actually feel heard, they feel valued, they feel respected, and feel understood. Not just here is the template, here's the framework, let's go.
The way the McKinseys would do that.
Exactly. So the bigger consultants, even by virtue of their size, they have to. There's no choice. I'm not saying it's a bad thing at all. It's just their reality. So that has helped. I mean, I know for RavelWorks, I would say over 90%, maybe I'm exaggerating, so, of our clients is referrals. It's because somebody has worked with us, says, no, if you want. And so we take on very, very few clients in a year, but we work with them intense, and we're happy with that. And sometimes I've noticed with some of our, potential clients, we're quite shocked because we turn people away. We say, I don't want to work with your agency or your organization. It's not about money. It's not about if you throw more money at the problem, will we take up the job? It just doesn't sound interesting. It's a waste of time because we can see you're not really invested. You want to do it as a tick the box, and that's not. We are fortunate enough that we don't have to take that kind of work.
You can afford to be selective.
We can be selective, so we're very fortunate about that. So that's one. I think the other thing is as well, maybe I'm gonna say we have noticed with US entities have become much more open to working with, at least with African consultancy firms. I don't know if that's the same everywhere else. That we saw the boom, I would say, from about 2020 going forward. And that's been very nice for us because in general, US entities are very easy to work with. They just have a problem, they need some help, and let's just go.
Is that different from other entities in there?
Yes.
Interesting. Yes. Tell me about the difference.
So like I said, I think and I'm not sure, I have a suspicion that for certain US, let's say, entities, maybe the whole Black Lives Matter kind of influence part of that as well, that people were looking now more to the global South to say, okay, let's actually, broaden. I would say not exclusively, but a lot of European entities still much more on the kind of, how do you say, control, check, validate, approve. And sometimes I know we ask ourselves, if you knew you could do it better than us, why did you hire us in the first place? Just do the job yourself, But there seems to be still a bit more that suspicion about like, well, it's an African company. Maybe they're just, riddled with corruption and nepotism. I mean, they're hiring their grandmothers to do the assessment. I mean, all of this kind of stuff. There's a lot more sometimes hurdles. And it's hurdles which, honestly, at times we then don't jump. We say, if this is how it's starting, I'm not even interested to work with you because it's already coming in from a basis of mistrust to start with, you see?
And so one can easily then think, okay, there is something neo-colonial or racist behind that, some people would say, right? And not, mind you, if we have a mind, if we have a brain, we have a bias, right? We all have biases, but that does sound like, and I know you're generalizing, Faye, so there are lots of exceptions, of course, to what you're saying, but you do see a little bit of a pattern difference there. Interesting.
Well, we have a joke sometimes, Tosca, and I know it might not be taken well by all of your listeners, but we have a joke sometimes that if as an African company you want to make it, what you need to have in your brochure is an old white guy, gray hair, with a bit of a pot belly, and his title is either chairman of the board or head of compliance, risk management, those kind of functions where then people kind of look at the organogram and they say, oh, at least somewhere there's an old white guy. It means we're safe with our money, with our investment. So it's just a joke that sometimes as companies, we say, let's hire one and we just rotate him around our brochures.
I would like to think, Faye, but I might be wrong. This might be wishful thinking that very few of my listeners, if anyone, would take this the wrong way. But I definitely I see your point. And so the obstacles that you cited were around that in some of the entities that approach you or that want to work with you or say they want to work with you, there's still that that mental model around corruption, around needing to check, is the knowledge in place, is the expertise in place, blah blah blah.
But specifically, and here I will really caveat that, that is really specific to the NGO sector and humanitarian sector. Interestingly, with private sector, we do not face this problem. They say, I have an issue, I need you to help me, can you do it? And they listen. You tell them, we are doing this, we're doing that, like, okay, because that's why they've hired you, because they recognize we have a gap. And so NGOs, it's very much that kind of control. Let me cross-check. Let me see. This doesn't make sense. Well, it doesn't make sense to you because it's not your area of expertise. That's why you've hired us. That's one. And two, you said that in the beginning, which is that belief. And I understand it's human nature. We all want to be unique in some shape or form.
Oh,
But
yeah.
NGOs have this very strongly, I am unique because, no, you're
Oh,
not. Your
you're
mission
not.
might be unique, but you know, your financial processes, logistics processes, you know, communication,
Yeah.
HR, some of those core processes are the same, whether you are in a big company, small company, this sector. You might be working on gender, I'm doing environment, somebody else is doing human rights. Those are just sector. It's the same like saying I'm in energy, you are in gas and petroleum, and somebody else is in farming.
Yeah.
But finance is finance, HR is HR. Yes, there might be some nuances to it, but you are not unique. You know, it's not like your financial accounting is completely different.
Hallelujah. I'm saying I'm so in agreement with you. It's an ailment in our sector, and we could talk more about that, but we shouldn't. So not now, at least, because we need to bring this conversation to a close soon. So let me ask you, and I don't mean this facetiously, Faye. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I do want to ask you for guidance.
Yeah.
What is an appropriate role left for Global North based consultants like myself and others like me? I think about this on a regular basis these days, and I'm starting to make some changes in my own practice and where I seek to obtain clients and what types of services. So what's your advice to people like me?
Well, one, and thank you for asking the question. I don't think it's you. It comes across as facetious at all, and doesn't put me on the spot either. I mean, one, we of course we're increasingly in a globalized world, so there is space increasingly for everybody, right? It's not to say as a Western practitioner, get out of here. You know, we don't want to hear from you anymore at all. I think where the role comes in, or what I see can be quite useful, is one, if we are approaching, as I say we, I'm not part of the we, but if as Western practitioners you approach your consulting, your OD, your advisory, is that with a little bit more curiosity, to understanding the why behind the why, and not just a surface level of, oh, well, this doesn't work at all, you know, the way we do it in Netherlands is like this, and therefore let me restructure everything, and the humility. So just because somebody has not written down their processes in a way that makes sense to you, or even more so, especially in the NGO sector, just because somebody's ability, because most of the work happens in English, just because somebody's ability in English is not to your level, they're not as fast, as witty, as quick, does not mean, you know, that their input and their ideas are not valued. So those are really the only two things I say, that there's a role for all of us, because we all come with an experience and knowledge that when you merge it properly, it can really, we can do some great stuff. But it
We are
requires
all
that
enriched.
humility. Exactly. It requires just humility and curiosity. It's not the mindset or the mental model of saying, well, what you're doing is not like how I do it, therefore it's wrong. That is problematic. It's saying, walk me through what is guiding you to set up your operations in this way. Because
Yeah.
there'll be a reason to it. You know, most organizations won't tell you, Tosca, I woke up in the morning and just randomly, this is how I structured myself.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's a very clear answer. That's very helpful. Thank you. So I'm going to ask you to finish a statement, and let's start with that. And that is, a bold idea that I recommend is ... How would you finish that statement?
Oh, I feel like a broken record. I always say the same thing. So a bold idea that I recommend is really, if you are leading an organization, a foundation, and a social enterprise, is choose courage over comfort. And that's not even my words, it's Brené Brown in one of her famous talks. But I find that always very guiding, because it's easy for us to fit into the boxes that are already there. And it's comfortable, and we're not raising any, you know, issues, and we can maybe progress in our career, but it doesn't help us to change systems or industries. So it's a bold idea is choose courage over comfort. When your heart is beating like this, that is the good time to act. And that's when you know, like, you're on the edge of maybe doing something new or different, and people won't necessarily like it or agree with, but that's very often the right thing to do.
Got it. Good. And that's also the motto of RavelWorks Africa, right? Growth begins at the end of our comfort zone. All right, Faye, where should people go to learn more about RavelWorks Africa and about you as a practitioner and managing director?
Well, first of all, of course, you can check out our website, which is www.ravel.works. I'm sure it will be in the show notes as well. And
Yeah.
you can also find us on LinkedIn, same way like me. I mean, those would be kind of the two main places where you can find us.
Okay, very logical answer. And Faye, if you've written something in recent times that you think speaks to what we like, a blog post or a short video or something, we're happy to also put that in the show notes to expose our listeners to more of your thought leadership. Very, very good to do that. Well, this was quite the conversation. Thank you, Faye, for all your insights. That gave us a lot of food for thought. It gave me food for thought, and I'm sure our listeners as well. So listeners, if you found this podcast stimulating, then be sure to check out some of the other episodes in my podcast, NGO Soul Strategy. We have several others about African models of management and leadership, such as Charles Kojo van Dijk, Adama Coulibaly or Cool, as well as we have some episodes about the art and the science of management consulting, like with Ajoy Datta, as well as with Ed Boswell. You can find all of that and more on my website, 5oaksconsulting.org. That is with the number 5. And if you subscribe to my email list through the site as well, you will always be the first to be in the know about what episode is being dropped next. So with that, I am saying goodbye. See you next time at NGO Soul and Strategy.